Welcome to The Moderate Catholic, where we discuss topics that deepen faith and inspire action. I am your host, Christina Gebel, and this is episode 13. What does Catholic theology say about modern families? Welcome, everyone. We have two very special guests today, both of whom I deeply admire for their work in the field of theology. We have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Julie Rubio and Dr. Jake Kohlhaas, and they have done much work in the field of theology as it relates to family. As we know, season 2 is focusing on the family. It's called Radical Family, and it's about families making bold choices to live out their faith. And I thought, what a great time in the season to zoom out a little bit and see what the Catholic Church has to say about families living out their faith. I couldn't ask for two better people to talk to about this topic. So with that, Dr. Rubio and Dr. Kohlhaas, would you mind introducing yourself?
I am currently a professor at the Jesuit School of Theology, which is part of Santa Clara University, but currently in Berkeley, California. Been here for about 8 years. And before that, I was at St. Louis University for about 20 years. Family has been central to my work from the very beginning, even as I define myself as a social ethicist. And it was really in planning my own wedding liturgy and my wedding that I first started developing an interest in marriage and family. It was the liturgy that really opened that up for me. And ever since then, I've just been fascinated with this tradition and excited about the possibilities for families in Catholic social ethics.
Yeah, and I'm Jake Kohlhaas. I'm a professor of moral theology at Loras College in Dubuque, Iowa. I've been here for 12 years and have a couple of books and edited volumes on family. It's been what I've been doing since my dissertation back at Duquesne University, particularly around parenthood and trying to think about a theology of parenthood. And more recently, that's taken me a bit more into social ethics and definitely into history, which is an endless investigation that you can keep going forever if you want. So that's where I'm at now.
Yes, thank you. And that's a great segue to the first question I wanted to talk to you all about today. So I put two and two together when I cracked open one of the edited volumes about church teaching on the family. And I met Julie when I was a theology student at SLU, and I don't think theology has ever truly left my brain. And I was so thrilled to see that volume, and it definitely scratched a theology itch that I've been missing for a really long time. You both contributed. Jake, I believe you were one of the editors of the volume. And what I liked about it was commentary on different encyclicals or church teaching on the family, but it went quite far back and it goes pretty far present too. So I was just wondering if you could start us off by distilling that volume into kind of where has the arc of theology been in the church? What is the church focused on in its messaging and its theology on the family?
I can start. So I was co-editor with Mary Doyle Roach on this volume. It's the idea of Catholic family teaching is something that kind of came up in my book, Beyond Biology. It's in the later chapter of thinking about teaching on marriage and family in the parallel way that we think about Catholic social teaching as a developing body of doctrine that grows and expands over time. The challenge is that the documents around marriage and family, you have to read them against their own protesting that they do not, in fact, change. But if you read them like social documents, there's quite a bit of movement and development going on through the history of it. So that's what I set out to do. And it was just so great to be in a field where we found lots of collaborators who are excited about the project and wanted to do it. The way it's structured, it starts back in 1880 with Arcanum, which is by Leo XIII. and then moves forward throughout time. And one of the things that's obvious right at the start is if you start stacking up the documents on marriage and family alongside Catholic social teaching documents, it's the same popes, roughly the same years writing them. They really fall pretty neatly in order. It gets a little more complicated in more recent history. But I would say just the overall short sort of summary arc is that when you start in the late 19th century, most of the concern is really the papacy attempting to assert itself in the face of new liberal democracies that have spread throughout the world. And so a lot of the concerns are political. They're trying to really stake their claim in education, stake their claim around marriage and divorce, and insist that these are the purview of the Catholic Church and that secular states have other legitimate areas, but not these. And so you get a lot of that in the early documents around the place of education, marriage, and regulation of divorce, and quite a bit around women's particular place connected to children and home life. By the 1930s, though, you get more interest in actual love in marriage, the relationship of marriage. And that's really the part that grows into the 1960s and Vatican II. You get some really remarkable changes with marriage as no longer a hierarchical relationship, but as a more mutual relationship. You move from a Pope Leo, who says that women's place within the home is part of divine law, to John the 23rd, who says women have discovered their own dignity, and it's different than what the popes had thought. So there's some really interesting developments. And then as you move towards the present, one of the things I pick up is I think in the 1960s, things really take a sharp turn towards reproductive moral issues with humana vitae and artificial contraception, things like that. So family becomes much more concerned with reproductive ethics than it had been. Then more recently, it becomes more about sexuality and gender issues. And then as we know at the present, issues of same-sex relationships and how that affects parenthood and inclusivity in the church. And it's really up to the present where these questions of who's included and how are they included and what counts and why remain pretty significant issues for the church today.
Yeah, and the volume is a great contribution. It's just wonderful to even have the words, the Catholic family teaching that we didn't have before. And there are so many great people writing in the volume. I wrote on Familiaris Consortio, so Pope John Paul II's apostolic exhortation from 1981. But I largely agree with the trends. One thing I would start with is that what to me is really unique about Catholic social teaching, Catholic family teaching, is that family is always seen as a part of what is called the social order or society. So it's never understood as this private, nuclear, romantic, whatever all of that is. That's just not our teaching. So it's always seen as one of the many intermediary associations, is the word, in society, similar to or like churches and schools and clubs and nonprofits and that kind of stuff. And it's prior to government, or the state has its own reality, which means it has its own rights that government has to protect and its own responsibilities. So I think that's constant. And yet what grows is the sense that not only is it just an important part of the social order, but it has a social mission. And that particularly comes to the fore with John Paul II. It's not enough just to love and procreate. That's just the beginning. And he's really explicit about that. And I find that's even surprising to people who think they're JP2 Catholics, right? Because they're used to reading Theology of the Body. He really underlines that. And then that just carried forward with Francis and beyond. And the other part, Jake already alluded to this, is about love. I think you can always, from the beginning, see this idea of mutual support and growth in holiness. So I think sometimes people will say, oh, Catholic teaching on family is only about procreation. That's never been true either. It's always had something else there. But love, this was actually a debate. Is love necessary for a legitimate marriage? Before, no, it wasn't. But it becomes essential. And then we have that beautiful language of the intimate partnership of life and love. And I feel like we're still exploring, honestly, what that intimate partnership is and what it means. This, to me, is something that we say, but beyond the language of self-gift, which I think is both helpful and not helpful, what does that look like over a lifetime? I think we're still figuring that out. And we're figuring out in a new way. Only really since the 1980s have we had married theologians who can speak to this with experience. And then the other part is the growing egalitarianism. That's just really clear. Sometimes I hear younger traditionalist Catholics citing Casti Connubii. It's, yeah, you can't do that. That is just not our teaching anymore. Male headship is not our teaching. There is a real egalitarianism, which is really actually evident in the marriage rite, which I would argue is less gendered than a lot of our social marriage rituals, including engagement rituals and things like that. You have to read that stuff and put it into the liturgy because it's not there except for in a few little places. But I would also agree that, especially since the 1990s and concern over same-sex marriage and more recently gender identity, there has been an assertion about gender difference. I would say yes, and yes, there are differences. What those are, I think, is very vague. Whether you can map trad wives and real Catholic men onto that, I think that's a big stretch. I often will ask my students, where do you see laundry or house cleaning or, these role divisions just really aren't there. We read them in, but there is an insistence that there is a difference and it matters, right? And that's been doubled down on the more that others are saying, no, there isn't, no, it doesn't.
Wow. We have really started out strong here. My brain is really humming. The fact about JP2 and how he really brought about that understanding of the family, and I'm going to use that, I think, in a future Facebook debate. I am very grateful for that tidbit. But to go back to that, and you both actually touched on it immediately, which was this interaction with Catholic social teaching. And I'll be honest with you, having studied both theology about the family and Catholic social teaching, I never really noticed the bridge. It's there in my mind as a person because I feel like I can't separate Catholic social teaching out from any part of my identity. But it seems like it's been there or been concurrent with a lot of this, and that might come as a surprise to some people who are listening, including myself. So can you say a little bit more about how those two have interacted and possibly where we are now with that interaction?
I would just say it is unique, perhaps, to our social teaching that you just can't separate family from it. Family is a crucial part of it. From what Jake was saying earlier about family being along with schools and the church as a way the church asserts its rights, but more broadly, the idea that a good society is one with a robust set of associations, including family, so that families matter to society. And that's just always been there. I think also the idea that families have rights and they're broad ranging, right? From the right to raise their children the way they want to and educate them and all of that, but also to the things that make their life possible, like housing and just wages. Those are a crucial part of the way that Catholicism views society. What you said is exactly right. Like, how can you separate Catholic social teaching from any part of your identity? You live in a family. How could it be irrelevant? It's that kind of question which really spurred my own desire to think more about family ethics, because I always had loved Catholic social teaching. And when I was getting married, I'm like, the bridge wasn't evident, right? And yet it should be. So how am I supposed to live this? Because it can't be that only the Dorothy Days and the Dan Berrigans, these are the heroes in my house. It can't be that they're the only ones who live Catholic social teaching. There's got to be a way for families to do this. So what would that look like? And I found both popular literature and role models from ordinary Catholic families who are living this out, but also teaching that was perhaps less emphasized in either side, either from people talking about family or people talking about social justice, and found that there was actually way more interaction than I realized and a lot to build on.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think one of the issues with the framing this idea of Catholic family teaching that's highlighted in the volume is, what is its relationship to Catholic social teaching? Because Catholic social teaching very clearly includes families as a part of society. They're fundamental to society. So Catholic social teaching has to cover families. The way it defines society, it's required to do that. But then there's also these other documents that speak specifically to families, often mostly about marriage, not necessarily about parenthood, which are both dimensions of family life. And so it becomes a question, is Catholic family teaching simply a subset of Catholic social teaching that gets some unique emphasis? Or is it its own thing that runs parallel? Then how do you account for that interaction? So I think it's very much an excellent and open question right now in the field, is trying to figure out what is the relationship between these bodies of literature that claim to be united, and yet there are some distinctions. For example, Catholic social teaching seems to work really well on principles when they're facing outward towards explaining what a just society ought to be. Principles like respect for human dignity, solidarity, subsidiarity. But where I think as a church community, it can start to stumble is when we turn those principles back inside, either to the church itself, the way things are structured within the church, or to families themselves, because you start running into these tensions between, and Julie was talking about this earlier, these specific roles that are supposed to be responsible for specific things because of the identity that goes with it. But then you say, but the principle of subsidiarity, you say the man's in charge of this. Solidarity with your wife might mean that maybe it's time for you to do this. Or subsidiarity, the mom's in charge of this, but in this instance, the dad's closer to it because he's more engaged with the child. So issue is an egalitarian marriage based in love is about mutuality, and it's about negotiating individual events and situations in thoughtful, respectful ways that principles can guide you through. So I think a lot of the language of Catholic social teaching very much applies to family dynamics. The issue there is that though we have some ideas about roles and places and things like that people feel like they have to be in, that makes it hard to apply the principle because of these other pieces getting in the way. And so I think in terms of the interaction between the two, I think there is some tension there in Catholic social teaching. We've known this for decades. This isn't brand new, but Catholic social teaching, when you turn it back on the structure of the church, raises some interesting questions. And I think when you turn it to families and you say, okay, you're the most fundamental cell of society, so let's apply social ethics, it raises some real questions about a lot of traditional norms and expectations that people bring into families and marriages. I think are very good questions. It just means there's a lot unsettled there.
I think that also it's just such a great opportunity to say, if this is an institution in society and part of Catholic social teaching, then these principles should apply, do apply. It's just that we haven't thought it through yet. One of the chapters of my dissertation was taking justice and applying that to housework, right? As only some feminist theologians have done. But of course it applies. And we don't have precise guidelines about housework in Catholic family teaching, only the vaguest of suggestions, even though people bring their ideas about that. But if you bring a justice lens, then I think you get some good guidance. So
Yeah, I would add, so in my research, one of the things I keep an eye on, which is difficult as a male theologian working in this field, I always want to know how dads are including, but historically I know dads have had the better end of the deal when it comes to marriage. So it's hard to work on the side of the privileged group and make sure we're not left out. But prior to Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis's document, the image of a man as a primary caregiver or capable of nurture, as far as I know, had only come up at one time in one document from the U.S. Catholic bishops. So Catholic teaching on the family, all the way through past the turn of the millennium, the idea that men can actually nurture their children is just not there. And for me, that was a big part of having kids, because I was more or less primary caregiver to one of our daughters when she was very young. And I think that's a piece of the puzzle there, is just to think about how a lot of these traditional roles and things that are assumed about families certainly work a lot better when you bring the lens of Catholic social teaching to it, to say, this is about the common good. This is about negotiating what's best for our family in this situation. That, yeah, can get more difficult when you think in very set ways about who does what and why. So it's not so much, as Julie was saying, not so much that the churches articulate specific gender roles, but there are some really interesting silences that tell us a lot about what's not being considered.
As you're talking, I'm thinking of my own career path. And after I spent time studying theology, I volunteered, and that kind of put me on a trajectory of working on public health and particularly public policies. And almost my entire career in public health has been policies that help mothers and families. It's interesting because when I was in public health school, there's a lot of concepts around we should write policy as if we're thinking about the people who could be most affected by it or who are most vulnerable to the changes that we're proposing. I had so many flashbacks to Catholic social teaching and thinking about things like preferential option for the poor, just things like that. And it's like I'm making so many parallels as you're talking because it's like to have a family, you also have to have Catholic social teaching. And in public health, we would say to have health, you also have to have good systems and policies. And the two are intertwined. And Julie, I want to go back to what you had looked into, which are some figures and certainly the Dan Berrigans and the Dorothy Days and all those things. All those exist. And I have friends who have pictures of Dorothy Day in their house when they teach their kids about Dan Berrigan. To me, that's very normal in our friend group. But I am interested in this question about how does this all jump off the shelves of theology? If a family really wanted to make Catholic social teaching a focus of living out their faith, where would they go today to get some guidance or some support from the wider world? Not even maybe necessarily the wider Catholic world, but where would they go to find like-minded people or resources or people to look up to, things to read? Is the church kind of meeting that interest?
Oh, that's interesting. When I first heard the question, I was thinking about official documents, but I think there is a problem of resources because if one looked at what's available for families, one wouldn't necessarily find much about Catholic social thought. So I think that those traditions remain fairly separate at the level of the parish or the diocese. Organizationally, it's difficult to find. The Christian family movement, which was important in the mid 20th century, especially in the Midwest, and it still has some global purchase, was in that See Judge Act model as a part of the Catholic Action movement. And it was a place where people would come together with like-minded people and think about what are we going to do in the world. First of all, it's not as popular in the US, and I don't know that's the focus today. I think in terms of what you might read Familiaris Consortio, especially the center of the document on the 4 tasks of the family, and especially the task about going into society and making an impact in the world. I think you could read Amoris Laetitia, especially the chapter on parenting, which is ignored. Everybody reads the controversial chapter 8, but the parenting stuff is really quite good. And so I think there is some guidance. In some ways, the papal stuff hasn't filtered down organizationally. But then I wish that parents and people with families would be really invited into the social justice groups in the parish. And what that would look like is different than what it looks like now, because maybe those groups meet at 11 in the morning or at 8 at night, and it just doesn't work. Models I've seen for that, like parishes that would have one topic and they would offer some food and then maybe a talk and then some prayer, all of this in an hour and a half for parents, but then provide not just babysitting, but a parallel program for kids. And so then when they got home, they could all talk about environmental justice or something like that. But that made it realistic for parents to go to. And it sent the message from the parish that we don't think that social justice is just for single people without kids and responsibilities.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot too of my career in public policy because when I started out in the field, I was told families are the hardest group of the population to mobilize. And I don't know where that came from. I don't even remember who said it. I don't know how true it is. I have no idea. But it was interesting for me because I was in a realm of public policy that was family policies. So I actually saw a lot of families mobilize. And I think sometimes there's an idea out there that families are just too full, too tapped out. And you even see this sometimes in some of the traditionalists thinking around family, like, you got to take care of your own family first. That's your calling. And every day you got to wake up and fulfill that. And I've had people say, I just got to focus on that. I can't think about all these other things. And also the privileges that come with being able to go to, like you said, like an 11 o'clock meeting at a parish is going to draw a certain demographic of people. And so I think about this a lot. I think about, are we creating opportunities? Are we creating resources? Has the beauty of the teaching really trickled down into programming and maybe more accessible resources on some of the encyclicals and things like that? I was very eager to comment on that because it's so interesting on so many levels.
Yeah, families, I think, are hard to mobilize because they are projects in themselves. Part of the calling to be a parent and have a family is to take special responsibility for caring for these people. But on the other hand, if you're going to parent well, part of it is also raising them to be socially responsible people. And you want to give them those experiences. So I do think a lot of it is just the challenge of, yeah, if you can get a single retiree out after hours, that's one thing. If you can mobilize 4 to 6 people and get them in the same room at one time, that can be really challenging. So I think there are just a lot of practical dynamics that are really challenging with this. On the other hand, I think a lot of people who are doing good work for society are doing it in part because they have professional abilities and things like that they're sharing with the community. Just because my whole family can't come with me to some of the boards and things I'm on doesn't mean I can't talk to the kids about it when I get home. And so I think there are ways in which when family members individually participate in certain capacities, you can bring that home. You're modeling responsibility to your kids, even if they're not there. I did mistakenly about a year ago bring one of my daughters to a commission meeting, and she was bored out of her mind. And I feel like she might never volunteer to be a part of that thing again. Maybe it's better if they don't come sometimes.
And I think it can work the other way too, right? And Mary Doyle Roach's work has been so good at pointing this out, that sometimes it's the kids that are leading the parents. And she has a good little book, Schools of Solidarity, that I think would be helpful. But yeah, sometimes it can be the kids coming home and saying, this is what we are doing through school or through their own activism. And then that evangelizes or expands the family's horizons. It can also happen like that. I have one model of ideal model in my head that's like the family version of Dorothy Day, but there's a lot more than that can happen.
Yeah, and it's so relevant to this season because this season is about families making bold choices to live out their faith. And it was interesting when I was recruiting people to this season. I asked a lot of people, actually, if I just said a family making bold choices to live out their faith, like, who would come to mind? And the reactions were so interesting. One was, a lot of people I asked were like, we don't really have a faith identity anymore. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was, either really it was in some ways maybe challenging to conjure up somebody. And I don't know if I had used language that made the bar feel really high. I have no idea. But what was interesting was like seeing people wrestle with that question. What was interesting also was sometimes the people they recommended were like, no, really, you should be talking to the person that recommended me because I see them as fulfilling this. So yeah, I think it is happening, and maybe we don't name it as such or think ourselves to be doing it, but it is happening. And some of the stories that have come out in this season are just incredible things that people are doing on a daily basis or decisions they've discerned and the like. So with that, I want to shift a little bit to Jake, and you've mentioned briefly about this kind of theology of parenting. That was a phrase that jumped out at me when I read the edited volume, because I was like, oh, what's that? And where is this? So, can you say a little bit about how you've engaged with that and where you got to and where you hope we might be going?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I'm really interested in parenting as the angle that I want to take in my research. I'm so glad Julie mentioned Mary's book too, because that is a good recommendation. It's very accessible. But through my dissertation and things like that, it just became clear to me that the official Catholic teaching on the family is missing some of the practical dimensions of what's actually involved in child rearing and marital life. A lot of emphasis on marriage, the permanence of marriage, the sacrament of marriage, and the value of children, the value of procreation for society, for marriages. But then when it comes to what is the day-to-day of actual caregiving and raising children, it doesn't have a lot to say. It has some visions of where that goes. And it uses the word education oftentimes as a placeholder to mean just a universe of realities. I'm trying to remember this. There was a document from way back that I was reading recently. I don't know, it was 1920s or something. It was a bishop saying, education for the Catholic Church, it means everything. And I think, geez, we've known this for 100 years. Maybe we should start actually articulating a little more clearly what we mean by that. Yeah, there's so much under that idea that parents' charge is to procreate and educate is clearly the much larger task of parenthood. So I have been working on that for a while to flesh out what this looks like. For me, I think it gets really complicated because you're dealing with interpersonal relationships. You're dealing with relationships that are never the same. No two families are alike. No two parent-child relationships are alike. No two sibling relationships are alike. So everything just gets really messy when you try to speak in a way that makes sense for a very massive, complicated reality. But my basic ideas at this point is that parenthood is based in caregiving. Caregiving is a common human ability that most people have the capacity to care for other people, attending to their needs over time. Parenthood is complex because in some ways it's given and in some ways it's chosen, but out of that, it's sacramental. It's an experience of grace in the world. And so really what parents are doing is being there to be present for God in their lives through the life of their children. And so that's where I'm working now, is to figure out how would I articulate a little bit more practical, a little bit more broader audience way of explaining some of these things. I think Catholic sacramental theology is an excellent place to start for thinking about what the family is. All the things we represent in the church are the realities we live in our family lives, of the incarnation and grace and sacramentality coming through in family dynamics. So that's where I'm headed with that currently. And then the whole other challenge is, what do you do when things don't go well, when there's pain in family? I remember my first book I was writing, the arguments about how many parents you need, what gender parents have to be, all that stuff that's occupied Catholics for a lot of time. When most of the social science research says stability is really the key thing, stable relationships is what people need to grow into maturity, stable, loving relationships, ideally. And then I had a friend of mine who's a gay theologian who said, you know what? Some families are very stable and very harmful. And so stability isn't necessarily a good thing if that stability is negative. If the stable message you're receiving is that certain people aren't included and things like that. So again, like, you can take something that seems like it should be common. Okay, stable families, that's great. But then there's the counterexample. So it just gets really challenging to speak in a way that's inclusive of all the different dimensions that family can be, and yet has some sort of common thread to it that's also understandable.
Yeah, the challenge therein is really vast. And I think, like you said, to speak to the diversity of experiences, but still come up with some tenets would be really challenging. But I admire that you have asked that question. I think in my ideal world, that would be a question the church really leans into in the next few decades. And speaking of questions the church is leaning into, So, Pope Francis called for the Synod on the Family. And at this point in the season, we've already had a great discussion with Casey Stanton from Discerning Deacons, who told us all about what a synod is. So we're up to speed on what a synod is and a synod on synodality and all that great stuff. But this question is about the Synod on the Family. And I'd like to hear from each of you what came out of the Synod on the Family. And do you feel like it was representative of kind of what people in the pews are wrestling with every day? Did the average family kind of get guidance on how to live out their family life? And where do you feel the conversation needs to go after the synod?
Let's see. So I think synods on the family were really important in the beginning of Francis' papacy. My own sense is that he knew that family and sexuality are places of pain for a lot of people in the Catholic Church, and that he wanted to ask a lot of people, he would have to first convince them that they belonged. And that's really what I think those synods were about, was sending out all those surveys and getting people to say what they thought the church taught and what their experience it was, what they needed from the church, and then having the bishops talk and argue together. And not a whole lot changed. People were upset that a lot of the hot button issues, of course, did not change, but there was that dialogue. So I think their significance is in the desire to include and to listen and to accompany. That was our first concretization of what is this accompaniment, and to be a church that's walking together. I think that they were representative in terms of the stuff that went to Rome. If you looked at all the surveys, not very representative in terms of experts. For instance, I mean, no experts, theologians on the family that I know of were there, or yeah. So that was disappointing in that sense. This was before women's participation in synods. So yeah. And no, there wasn't more guidance for everyday life. I think it was really just about Francis repeating, "You are welcome, nobody can be excluded forever," all of that was important. I don't see families being very involved in the current synod on synodality dialogue. Honestly, most people I've seen involved in those kind of dialogues are single people, a lot of older people. So yeah, I think that we probably need to bring back synodal kind of conversations in parishes and among families, getting beyond the about synodality piece to like, what are our actual problems? What do we need to do?
Yeah, I think Francis' document, Amoris Laetitia, that came out afterwards, is almost more representative of the state of the church, and it really changed anything. One of the things I think is so interesting is in the early chapter, it really insists on the importance of gender distinction between within marriage and for parenting. And as Julia already talked about the chapter on parenthood, you could just insert the word parent instead of mother and father. There's no gender distinction. So this, on the one time, insistence that something's really important, and then when you talk about the application, the inability to connect why it's important, really represents where we're at. And so I think Amoris Laetitia is like, it's just a good representation. But again, its tone was important. Its openness was important. It didn't really change much. I will say, I think some of the processes of the synod that are now getting more common as Leo has taken on the same trajectory, I think, we might look back and say, oh, Francis started that. For example, when they did the preliminary meetings and the Vatican released the vote counts on some of the paragraphs in the preliminary documents, just the admission that there was disagreement among the bishops about some of these things was something that we had never done publicly before, right? That was always behind closed doors, and you just get the final document which says all the bishops agree to this. It caused some controversy. I think the bishops didn't love it, and it hasn't happened since. But now we're more comfortable with the idea that globally the bishops don't agree on everything, and the German bishops are doing one thing and other bishops, and that's just become our sense of what the dynamics of the church are. So there's a lot involved in the process that Francis did that really opened the door for some of the things that we're experiencing now in the Synod on Synodality and the processes of synodality, that I think looking back we'll say, oh, that's where it started. So it didn't lead to a really groundbreaking document, but it did lead to some communal practices that I think are becoming more common and are frankly more healthy for the life of the church. And on some of these issues that for generations we're basically told these can't change, they won't change, they're too essential to change. Now they're saying the development happens and there's reasons to think about this. And if we're going to get a real theology of family, it has to get to the experience of families. And I think we are gradually opening ourselves to that. Of course, we'll find it super complicated and really hard to do anything consistent with. But
Yeah, it almost makes me think about, while you're talking, if there was an edited compilation of Family Teaching Volume 2 that came out 150 years from now, and what would those documents say? And I appreciate the candidness about what the Synod on the families did and didn't do. And I think this is one of my struggles as a Catholic, as a Facebook commentator on Catholicism, is that every time there is this kind of flurry of activity around something, I think the secular world expects there to be a big change at the end. But as Catholics, like you said, just some of the basic things that activity accomplished, while not necessarily breaking news that's going to show up on your phone, really did start some openness to things that haven't previously been open. So it is interesting, just like you said, to admit that not all the bishops see this the same way is a big step. So I do appreciate that. So we're coming down to our last couple questions. One of them I sent earlier for you to muse on, and then the other one's going to be a total wild card that you've never seen before. So, but let's start with, again, going back to the theme of the season, families making bold choices to live out their faith. I talk about in the first part of the season that this idea of radical, I think colloquially we think radical extremes, but really I heard it in a homily and it really talks about getting to the root of something. And I talk about, it's almost like a little bit of a circular logic, like when you get to the root of Christianity and what it's really saying, it actually is quite radical, right? So I wanted to ask you both, when you think of the phrase radical family, who are some families that come to mind in your own spheres personally, or any families making bold choices in the faith realm?
when I looked at this, when I think of what the gospel asks of us, I think, boy, that's scary, even thinking of it as an individual. And then when I think about my family, I think, oh, no, that's too much. I think I do have a bit of a protectionism. I like my life to be a little bit predictable. The families I really admire are the ones who are more open to that, the people who can really bring people into relationships with their families, who are the kind of people that have a lot of chaos in their lives. Something as simple as a good family in town who does a lot of foster parenting. And it's not just the raising kids, but also where the kids' parents then become a piece of that puzzle. We try to be a very open family, a place where all the kids come to hang out, which is getting scary and scarier as they're more teenagers and stay up really late. But it's controlled chaos. And I think the people who can really, really look at other people's needs and say, our family can respond to that. We don't know where it's going to go. Those are the kind of people that I really admire, who can, really have relationships with people whose lives are chaotic and manage that with their own families. I just think there's so much that sort of whatever social class you're in sticks you in that, and then you can pretty much not have to think about other things because you're just dealing with people who are like you. And the people who have both the compassion and insight to move beyond that, I think, are the people I admire most. People who put up with helping people in relational ways that I would find really terrifying are the people I admire.
Yeah, and actually, we've had a family who fosters on the season. And I immediately thought of that too, actually, Jake, because it certainly isn't uncommon to foster. And in my kind of Catholic social justice-y group of friends, people talk really openly about, oh, we thought about it, or things like that. But it actually is a very radical opening up of your home, of your family. I deeply admire people who make that choice. So yeah, Julie, who would come to mind when you think of that question?
I think of it first. Okay, so what do I mean by radical? And I think that the most serious ethical choices of an ordinary person's life are about work, time, and money. Most of us aren't dealing with choices that have to do with war or things like that. Of course, in other places, yes. But those are the key choices. Why are we working? What are we doing with our work? What about the rest of our time? How are we spending our money? And then for a family, it's also about how do we use our home? And that's why I think I and others in the field have been influenced a lot by David McCarthy's book on Sex and Love in the Home and the portrait he draws of the open home. And I think my answer in this way parallels Jake's. How do you open your home and your life? How do you practice the universal destination of material goods and the social aspect of your goods and your property with your home? Really thinking of it that way. It was one of the things that attracted me to St. Louis, actually, in some ways, that there were definitely a group of families, and the Jim and Kathleen McGinnis, who wrote Parenting for Peace and Justice, were originally part of that, who lived in the city in a place that was somewhat dangerous and lived simplicity and opened their homes and were deeply involved in social justice work, and they were remarkable. I think about them. I also think about families that I met when I was in Nicaragua and El Salvador, who were so much more radical and open than middle-class families who presumably had a lot more bandwidth. Great stories in Meb Paleo's book, The Struggle is One. I think we sometimes think that this is something only privileged families can be super radical. And I actually think that the real role models are often people who have less and somehow find ways to share what they have. But I guess I don't want it to be the radical as much as I want to say, yeah, there are these radical role models. We need the saintly families. I also want to think about the smaller choices that people make that are also significant. Families who open their homes in that there's always a gathering on a Friday night, or they just are that house in the neighborhood where everybody feels safe and everybody feels welcome. Or there are some people who can't handle that in their house. And so they go out, but they have a regular commitment to the soup kitchen at their parish or something like that. So I just want to lift up all of those choices too. Or the parents who make big sacrifices to send their kids to Catholic school, not because they want them to get into the best college, but because they want them to be formed. Yeah. So I think there are a lot of ways that families can do these things once they just start asking those questions. I think about, work, time, money, and this resource we have in our relationships in our home.
And something that you both touched on that speaks to me in your answers to that question is just the role of community in that. Again, my Catholic social justice-y group of friends, most of whom have children at this stage, are always talking about when do we actually move to the commune or take over a cul-de-sac or something. And I think it just speaks to this feeling that a lot of times some of those choices are easier when you have other people around you choosing those things, and you have other people to wrestle with when those choices get hard and complicated. And you at least have somebody to go to ask that question, because I think as a Catholic trying to live out your faith in so many ways, you think about sometimes, who's the friend that I can really go and pick their brain on this? I feel very lucky personally to have friends that I know I could tap and say, can you wrestle with this faith-filled question with me? And it makes me really want for those spaces in our church. It makes me really want for more places like that in our church to gather. And maybe it's not even formal or programmatic, but just to know that you have other people out there. Because I think Catholics in my generation, having moved to several different cities, you church shop a lot, right? And there's some parishes where you can tell there's other people there that are really interested in questions like these, and there's other parishes that just seem kind of, for lack of a better word, flat. And so that's one of my hopes for the future. I do agree, Julie, that even just the smaller, more intentional choices are so big. I see my friends with kids say, what are you guys doing about cell phones? What are you guys doing about tablets? And what are you guys doing about screen time? And like modern parents have so much to think about. And my Catholic friends are not only thinking about it from like a parenting angle or whatever, child development says you should do this, but they're really thinking about it on a faith level. And I will say, if I answer that question, if I may, I actually think of your family, Julie, that I was privileged to witness in my undergrad years and growing up. I came to the inspiration for this season because I wanted people to think about somebody's home that you go into. And Jake, I haven't been in your home, but I have a feeling I'd have the same feeling that you just go in little ways that something different is going on and something really intentional is going on. And it doesn't have to be the big, huge choices. It's like really a level of intentionality about who we are as this family unit and who we are as a family of faith, or how we think about the harder questions of the world. And I get that vibe too when I go into a lot of friends' homes that are really thinking about this. There's something different there that people are really making an earnest effort to discern. So, any thoughts on that before we move to our final question?
For the whole spring semester, I was in Ireland. So I was living in a little apartment. My family was there for most of the time. I just got back the other day and I walked in our house, and you'd think I'd be like, oh, it's so great to be home. My first thought was, there's so much dog hair in here. So yeah, my home is very inclusive of pets as well.
I was just thinking about a wedding of a former student, a former JST student I went to a few weeks ago, and it was presided and preached by two of the students' classmates here. And people were so moved by it. And I think it's precisely what you're talking about, Christina, because there was a clear intentionality here that was evident in all the choices about the readings, which were not readings anybody typically chooses, and the songs and everything. And it did have much more of this social justice focus. And it was just clear. And it was clear in the preaching, and it was clear in the way that they welcomed everyone and the priorities that were evident, and people just felt it. And that was new and that was different, and it was exciting. Yeah, a wedding is a particular kind of power or occasion where a lot can happen because it's a ritual, but also in your family life, in intentional choices, there's a lot that can happen.
Absolutely.
I don't know if I don't think of it as radical, but I really do admire people who can build intentional and structure into their, I don't know, my family dynamic is just not like that. We're a bit too chaotic. And I think my wife and I are much more dreamers than follow through kind of people. So we're more ideas than actual structure. But I do know some families who really have intentional practices. And I just think it can be really powerful. I know as kids grow to have those things to come back to.
So, on to our last question, I'd like to hear from each of you. How would you answer to the question, what is the modern Catholic family called to today?
Love. The more I get complicated in this, more I come back to God is love. And that's what the Catholic tradition is showing us, that God's love permeates reality. And the most important things in our lives are the things that are the most important to God as well. That those loving relationships are where you find the divine. So for me, I think that's the bottom line. It's all about love, because all of creation is about love. And so if you're going to invest your life in something, you better make sure it's a loving enterprise. So I think that's where we're at. I think we're at a unique point in history where we've decided that egalitarian marriage, a mutual loving relationship in which people aren't just mutual in the sense that they respect each other, but are mutual in the sense that they really understand each other as equal persons with equal rights and responsibilities, is not the way for most of human history marriage has worked. It's wonderful that we're embracing this. And I think from a Christian perspective, it's the trajectory that's the best for us to discover this. I think Julie had mentioned this earlier, but I just wonder how much we're still working out the implications of things that were said 100 years ago around what marriage is, because it just raises so many new questions. I think egalitarian marriage based on love is just a wonderful experiment that has a rich Christian dimension to it, but is also something pretty new in human history. And it's kind of cool to be a part of exploring where theology goes in this new sphere.
Yeah, and I would just say that I don't know that we can answer the question fully without knowing the where, that it depends on your context. What's most important to me about Catholic family is that it is a vocation. Marriage is a vocation that is a vocation of discipleship. And so just a person who devotes their life to religious life, a sister or brother or priest, you're living out a vocation of discipleship. And so what you're called to depends on what's going on in your neck of the woods. And the family is going to look different in every context. I love Rick Gallardi's language of marriage as daring adventure. And I worry that we're losing some of that idea today. Some people, I think, are cynical about marriage. Others are scared of it. I just hope that we can embrace it as a daring adventure that I think Jake is right. It's a new kind of adventure right now, this loving, egalitarian partnership, intimacy, all of that is huge. And then also in Catholic teaching with this deeper sense of social mission, but in your context, right? But it is a lot. It is a lot. And I guess what I hope for is that people see that it's adventurous and worth committing to.
I think that's a great gem to leave our conversation on. And I do want to say you both have mentioned really good, interesting reads and resources, and I will try my best to compile those in the show notes. But this has been a really enriching time together. I can't say enough how highly I think of both of you, not only as theologians, but as ones that are coming to these questions at this unique time and place in history. And my hope with each episode in the season is that it stirs something in people listening, and maybe it's not this earth-shattering conclusion, but maybe it's a whisper or a flame of something that was said here that gets people to crack open one of those resources or think more about an open home or think more deeply about our call to love and discipleship. And I really just want to thank you both for leading us on this journey of discussion and hopefully the adventure that awaits. So thank you.
Thank you. And for me, you are my favorite Facebook theologian, Christina, and I'm grateful for what you do. Really am grateful.
I'm going to add that to my CV. Thank you. It's a rough time out there.
I know. But you hang in there.
Yeah, I'm trying to hang in.
Great talking to you both.
Thank you.